Well now, look who wandered in just before dream time. Welcome, my dear traveler, to the Academy of Sleep. I'm Grandpa Ryan, your humble guide through old stories, quiet wonders, and the kind of history they don't rush to tell you in school. The kind that drifts like sea foam and lingers like a bedtime breeze. Now, before your eyelids start doing that little sleepy dance, why not tap that subscribe button? Go on, do it now. You'll thank yourself in the morning. And then, we'll begin. History of Australia. From convicts to a great nation. Introduction. Tonight, we invite you to get comfortable, lie back, and let yourself drift. Before we dive into the wild, unpredictable story of Australia, a place where kangaroos roam the streets, emus win wars, and rabbits conquer continents. But first, let's take a moment for a bit of relaxation. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Notice the feeling of your body supported by your bed or couch. Take a slow, deep breath in. Hold it for a moment, and then exhale gently. Let your shoulders drop, and let any leftover tension from the day melt away. You're not in a rush. Breathe in again, slow and easy, and let it out. As you settle in, imagine the sounds of the Australian bush, maybe the distant calls of kookaburras, the soft rustling of eucalyptus leaves in the wind, and the steady rhythm of your own breath. Each inhale brings calm, each exhale, a little more relaxation. Now, as your body begins to unwind, your mind can start to wander, far from daily worries and toward a land that almost seems to have been designed as the world's largest outdoor experiment. Australia is a continent of contradictions and surprises. On one hand, it's ancient, a land where some of the oldest traces of humanity have been found, and where life has survived in total isolation for tens of thousands of years. On the other, it's a country with a history that sometimes reads like a practical joke. Rabbits that multiply out of control, fences longer than most countries, and a war against emus that the humans famously lost. But don't worry, you won't need a hat with corks hanging from it, and you won't wake up with a kangaroo in your room. Tonight, you'll just listen and float through stories of outlaws and gold rushes, daring explorers, bizarre animals, and a motley crew of accidental settlers. Convicts, sheep, gold diggers, and dreamers. Get ready for a fascinating, straight-talking story of how a giant island full of oddities turned into the nation we know today. So, as you breathe in once more and let it out slowly, let the gentle curiosity of this journey help you slip toward sleep. Australia is waiting, strange, stubborn, and full of tales that could only happen there. Ready? Let's begin our journey at the edge of the world. Chapter 1. A continent at the edge of the world. Let's set the scene. Picture yourself looking at a world map, the old school kind you might see hanging in a classroom. Down in the corner, there is Australia, sitting quietly and far away from almost everything else. Some people even forget to include Australia on world maps. If you are Australian, that can be a running joke, or sometimes a source of mild outrage. There is a reason why Australia looks so distant. It really is. Australia is the world's biggest island, and at the same time, it is also the smallest continent. You could say it is the planet's loner, drifting on its own in the southern hemisphere, not particularly bothered about what everyone else is doing. In geological terms, Australia is a true antique. While other continents spent millions of years crashing together, building mountain ranges and causing earthquakes, Australia just quietly broke off and floated away about 50 million years ago. Since then, it has minded its own business. There are no dramatic earthquakes here, no towering new mountains, and no surprise visits from other continents. If the continents were people at a party, Australia would be the introvert who leaves early, but still ends up with the most interesting stories. This long separation is why Australia's landscape and wildlife can seem so unusual. Most of the animals and plants here exist nowhere else. Think about kangaroos hopping across open fields, koalas clinging to the highest tree branches, and the platypus, which looks like it was designed as a joke. Then you have giant birds like the cassowary and emus, not to mention a long list of animals ready to bite, sting, or surprise you if you get too close. It is not just the wildlife that makes Australia feel different. The land itself is incredibly old. Most of the Australian interior, known as the outback, is some of the oldest, flattest, and driest land on Earth. Here, rivers disappear into red sand, dust gets into everything, and water is often more precious than gold. Even the soil is tired. Plants have had to adapt in strange ways, like the eucalyptus tree, which has oily leaves that can catch fire during hot summers. Australia is actually the driest inhabited continent on the planet. Of course, Antarctica is drier, but nobody is having backyard barbecues there. For most Australians, rain is something that happens rarely. When it does rain, it tends to arrive all at once, flood everything, and then disappear again for months or even years. If you want an environment that teaches people to adapt, laugh at their own bad luck, and just get on with it, Australia is the perfect place. So, why is Australia so isolated? It is all thanks to the ancient supercontinent called Gondwana. A long time ago, all the land on Earth was stuck together. Then, about 180 million years ago, these land masses began drifting apart. Australia broke away and moved south and east, splitting from Antarctica for good about 50 million years ago. Since then, it has been left alone, a floating laboratory where evolution got creative. Because of this separation, Australia missed out on many of the great plagues, big predators, and ice ages that shaped the rest of the world. When humans finally arrived, they found a place full of life that was both familiar and very strange. Imagine arriving on another planet, where the locals are marsupials and trees shed their bark instead of leaves. So when people call Australia the land down under, it is more than just a catchy nickname. Australia truly sits apart, both on the map and in the imagination. Its isolation has created a natural laboratory for life, filled with stories that are strange, funny, and unforgettable. As we continue our story, remember this: almost everything about Australia, from its landscapes and creatures to its people, has been shaped by this long, stubborn separation from the rest of the world. If Australia had a personality, you might call it quirky, fiercely independent, sometimes dangerous, but never boring. Now, let's move on and meet the first people to call this continent home. They found ways to survive and thrive, turning one of the world's strangest islands into a place with rich and lasting culture. Chapter 2: The Oldest People on Earth. Now that we have landed on the world's loneliest continent, it is time to talk about its very first people. Forget the idea of empty wilderness. Humans have called Australia home for tens of thousands of years, long before the first Europeans ever got lost at sea and crashed into its shores. The story of the first Australians goes so far back in time that it almost feels impossible. Scientists believe that Aboriginal Australians arrived at least 50,000 years ago, maybe even much earlier. Back then, the world was in the grip of the last ice age, and Australia looked a little different. Sea levels were lower, so you could actually walk, island by island, from Southeast Asia all the way to the northern tip of Australia. Still, it was not a casual afternoon stroll. Imagine crossing rough seas, jungles, and new landscapes, with only your courage, basic tools, and a healthy respect for whatever was lurking out there. Once they arrived, these first Australians began one of humanity's greatest experiments in survival. Australia is not exactly a gentle place to live. There are deserts that go on forever, forests filled with unfamiliar sounds, and an unpredictable climate. But the Aboriginal peoples adapted brilliantly. They became true experts in reading the land, knowing when to move, what to eat, and how to survive every twist of nature's moods. Aboriginal Australians are among the world's oldest continuous cultures. For thousands of generations, they passed down their knowledge through stories, songs, and art. Forget about written records. These people used memory and tradition, sharing everything important through what is called the dream time, or the dreaming. This is not just a bedtime story for kids. The dreaming is a whole way of seeing the world. It explains where the land, the animals, and the people all come from, and how they fit together. Every hill, rock, and river has its own story, told and retold in song lines, essentially walking maps that help people find their way across vast distances. Life was not just about surviving. It was about thriving in tune with the land. Aboriginal people learned to use fire to shape the landscape, helping certain plants grow and creating clearings for animals. They knew which plants could heal, which ones could kill, and how to find water where nobody else could see it. Their diet was like a masterclass in foraging: wild yams, honey ants, witchetty grubs, bush tomatoes, and yes, even kangaroo. They could find food and water in places where most visitors would simply give up and call for a pizza delivery. Australia was not just one big happy family either. Before European settlement, the continent was home to hundreds of distinct nations and languages. Each group had its own territory, customs, and ways of life. Some groups were expert fishers, building complex fish traps in the rivers. Others became desert travelers, moving with the seasons and following the food. There were trade routes, alliances, rivalries, and a deep respect for the land that connected everything together. Aboriginal Australians did not build giant cities or pyramids, but that does not mean their lives were simple. They built sophisticated tools, such as boomerangs, spears, and grindstones for making flour. They invented woes to store water for the dry season. Some groups even built permanent houses using tree bark, stone, or earth. Their art is among the oldest on the planet, covering cave walls with images of animals, spirits, and people. Some of these paintings are older than the pyramids of Egypt. For most of human history, Aboriginal Australians lived with very little outside contact. The land shaped them, and they shaped the land right back. It is easy to look back and think of ancient Australia as a slow, peaceful place. In reality, it was as complicated as any other part of the world, with moments of conflict, negotiations, cooperation, and great creativity. Of course, The outside world did not stay away forever. Over thousands of years, the Aboriginal peoples developed a way of life perfectly suited to Australia's unpredictable climate and wild landscapes. But as you will see, this long period of isolation was about to end, and it would change everything. So next time you hear someone say that Australia's story begins with convicts or gold miners, remember this. The oldest chapter is written in song lines, stories, and footsteps that go back tens of thousands of years. It is a chapter that still shapes the country today. In the next part of our journey, let's take a closer look at the odd and wonderful creatures that shared this continent with the first Australians. From bouncing kangaroos to giant lizards, get ready for some of the most unforgettable wildlife stories on the planet. Chapter 3. Kangaroos, Sea Cucumbers, and Everything Edible. Surviving in Australia is like playing a game on the hardest level, except there are no save points, and you do not get many hints. Imagine arriving in a place where there are no gentle valleys, no peaceful rivers, and not a single friendly animal waiting to be your pet or your meal. Almost everything is either covered in thorns, loaded with poison, or just too fast to catch. Still, Aboriginal Australians managed not only to survive, but to thrive here for tens of thousands of years. They did it with a menu and a set of tools that might seem very simple to an outsider, but were perfectly adapted for life in such a tough place. If you asked what was for dinner in ancient Australia, you wouldn't get a long list. It was all about being practical, tough, and kind to the environment. Forget about bread, cheese, or anything you can milk. The main course was often kangaroo. You might think of kangaroos as cute cartoon animals, but in reality, they are strong, quick, and, according to locals, they taste pretty good. The best part is the tail. For a kangaroo, the tail is more than just something to balance with. It is like a built-in emergency food supply, full of fat and protein. While most animals have a tail for wagging, the kangaroo's tail is almost like a sausage attached to its body. Another dish on the menu was the sea cucumber known as trepang. These are not vegetables from the sea, but soft, slow creatures that crawl along the ocean floor. You do not need fancy tools to catch them. Just dive into the water, pick one up, and there is your meal. It might not be everyone's idea of a perfect dinner, but it is always available if you are willing to go looking for it. This approach to food was all about getting what you need with the least effort. There was no need to invent bows and arrows or complicated traps if you could throw a rock at a kangaroo or grab a sea cucumber with your hands. In fact, researchers believe that early Aboriginal Australians arrived with some advanced tools, but over time, they switched to using what worked best with the least trouble. Some call this a step backward, but it was really smart adaptation. If you can catch your dinner without extra tools, why make life harder? The material culture of Aboriginal Australians became focused on what was necessary. Axes were made from chipped stones. Spears and digging sticks were shaped from wood. There were no metal tools, no wheels, and boats were usually just hollowed logs that could float across a river or reach a nearby island. There was wisdom in this kind of simplicity. Aboriginal people did not take more than they needed. They did not cut down trees or hunt animals just to store extra food. Each day was about what was needed in that moment. If there was food today, That was good. If not, it was time to walk along a traditional route and look for more. Life in Australia was all about moving with the seasons. Aboriginal people were hunters and gatherers, and they followed the cycles of plants, animals, and the weather. They knew when and where to find different foods. There were special paths for every season, one for fish, another for sea cucumbers, another for grubs or berries, and another for gatherings and ceremonies with neighbors. These routes were not just roads, they were sacred, full of stories and meaning. Crossing into someone else's territory without permission was very serious and could lead to real trouble. Over the centuries, this way of life created a network of small communities, each with its own customs, lands, and favorite foods. If you were an Aboriginal Australian, you would know exactly where to go for everything, from food to festivals. You would also know who to trade with, who to avoid, and how to share what you had. To survive, you did not have to be the strongest or even the cleverest. What mattered most was being connected to the land and understanding its patterns. Knowing when to travel, what to eat, where to find water, and which places to avoid was the key. Mistakes could be dangerous, so you had to listen to your elders, watch nature closely, and respect the limits of the land. The traditional foods of Aboriginal Australians might seem strange to outsiders, but many are still eaten today. Kangaroo, sea cucumbers, lizards, grubs, and a wide variety of plants were prepared by roasting over coals, baking in ashes, wrapping in leaves, or sometimes eating raw. There was no idea of fancy or high-class cooking, but there was a deep knowledge of what was safe, what was nutritious, and what was dangerous. This style of cooking was about survival. It was honest, natural, and made with whatever nature gave on any given day. It was also more sustainable than many of our modern diets that rely on packaging and shipping food around the world. Some people later thought Aboriginal Australians needed to be civilized, but the truth is, they already had a system that worked for them. There was no rush to build cities or chase new inventions just for the sake of change. With a stick, a fire, a trusted path, and a song, you could have a good life, one that respected both the land and the limits of what you really needed. Living in ancient Australia was about understanding your environment and living within it, not conquering it. That lesson is still valuable today, no matter where you live. Chapter 4: The Great Isolation and Purposeful Simplicity. When you think about the story of Australia, do not just picture a land frozen in ancient times. Australia's history is also about the longest, toughest kind of isolation you can imagine. Picture moving to a remote cabin in the Stone Age and staying there for 40,000 years with no visits from neighbors, no mail, and absolutely no deliveries. There were no conquerors, no big religions, no waves of new inventions, and no trade routes from far away. It was just you, the land, the kangaroos, and maybe the occasional sea cucumber for dinner. Aboriginal Australians ended up completely cut off from the rest of the world. And that is not an exaggeration. The closest other people were thousands of kilometers away. There were no bridges, no camels, no ferries, and no easy way to get across the endless ocean. The land itself was a challenge, dry, wild, and demanding, that you forget whatever you learned elsewhere and invent new ways to survive. Progress, at least the kind most people imagine, did not arrive. Most of the world followed a familiar story. First came hunting, then farming, then towns and cities, and eventually all the paperwork and technology of modern life. In Australia, this chain broke right in the middle. Farming never caught on. The move toward towns and more complex societies just did not happen. Instead, things actually got simpler as people adapted. Some of the very first Australians probably brought more advanced tools and skills, but many of these turned out to be unnecessary. Why farm when the soil is as hard as concrete? Why invent the wheel when nothing but thick bush lies ahead? Why build stone houses when wood and bark are enough for what you need? In the end, what did not work simply fell away. What lasted was not primitive. It was practical. It was all about getting by with the least effort and the most sense. Tools and culture focused on what was useful for survival, not on showing off or keeping up with some imaginary race for progress. One result of this deep isolation was the long preservation of Aboriginal culture. While the rest of the world saw waves of conquerors, new religions, wars, missionaries, and trade networks, Australia kept its own rhythm. No one came to force change. Traditions survived almost untouched for thousands of years. Some people call this stagnation, but to Aboriginal Australians, it was stability and resilience. Songs, dances, hunting techniques, ceremonies, and language structures all survived, passed down with incredible accuracy. While most written histories get lost after a few hundred years, Aboriginal families passed down 2-hour-long songs, word for word across centuries. Imagine keeping family recipes alive for 100 generations with every ingredient remembered perfectly. Of course, this was not a museum life. The land kept everyone on their toes. Australia was once home to some truly strange and giant animals, often called the megafauna. When the first people arrived, there were giant kangaroos, up to 3 meters tall, wombats as big as cars, 6-meter lizards called megalania, and even massive plant-eating creatures like the diprotodon, which looked like a cross between a bear and a hippo. There were no giant killer platypuses, but there were enough oddities to fill a fantasy novel. What happened to them? Most scientists believe it was a combination of human arrival and natural climate changes. Big, slow animals that take years to have babies are always at risk when new predators appear. Humans with fire and simple weapons probably did not wipe them out overnight, but they sped up the process. As the big creatures vanished, the survivors were the ones that were small, quick, venomous, or just too weird for predators to catch. That is why today, Australia is famous for its wild parade of hopping, crawling, and sometimes dangerous animals, not for massive mammoths or giant birds. So, did Aboriginal Australians fall behind? The answer depends on how you see success. They did not build cities, invent writing, or create big armies, but they built a system that worked for their world. They kept only what they needed, optimized everything for survival, and left out the extras. This was not failure. It was a kind of quiet, stubborn genius. Even today, some aspects of Aboriginal culture can puzzle outsiders. The languages, for example, have complex systems for sorting not just people and animals, but even directions and objects for rituals. Some languages give gender or status to the wind or to a walking path. It is a level of detail that drives some linguists mad with curiosity. So next time someone calls ancient Australia backward, ask them this: could you survive for 60,000 years in the Stone Age? with only what you carry, and be happy. Chapter 5. When nobody comes to visit. Imagine the world's biggest party. Europe, Asia, and Africa are all shouting across the room, trading, exploring, starting empires, and getting into everyone's business. There are ships sailing, flags being planted, and deals being made on every continent. Meanwhile, Australia is sitting quietly in the farthest corner, holding a sign that says, "Do not disturb." For tens of thousands of years, nobody really tried to crash this party. No armies came, no missionaries landed, and even the boldest explorers sailed by, with hardly a second glance. For Aboriginal Australians, life carried on by the fire, staring out at the horizon, probably wondering if anyone would ever show up. But for nearly 60,000 years, no one made a serious attempt. Now and then, a mysterious boat would appear on the horizon, with some even more mysterious visitors. They would take one look at the coast, wrinkle their noses, and disappear back into the sea. It was the definition of a continent alone. The closest potential visitors were from the Indonesian islands and Papua New Guinea. Indonesian sailors were already traveling across the Pacific by the Middle Ages. They settled thousands of islands, reached New Zealand, and crossed half the map. So why did they skip Australia? The answer was simple. There was nothing here they wanted. No spices, no fertile land, not even a good fruit to take home. Just endless bushland, strange lizards, and local people who had no interest in setting up a trade agreement. Aboriginal Australians did not build ports, did not sell coconuts, and did not line up at the beach waving gold jewelry or making markets. From the point of view of an Indonesian sea captain, Australia was simply not worth the trouble. Contacts did happen, but they were rare and mostly accidental. A shell might be traded, a sea cucumber collected, but that was the extent of it. Nothing ever developed into real, steady contact. Then, there were the Chinese. In the 15th century, China was an ocean powerhouse. Zheng He led massive fleets as far as India and the east coast of Africa. Some believe his ships may have reached northern Australia. There are old maps and rumors, but there is no solid proof. No settlements, no teapots, no scrolls or colonies. The usual story is, yes, we were there. We just did not mention it. It is a convenient story, especially if you do not have to prove anything. Next up were the Portuguese. In the 16th century, Portugal was expanding everywhere. They controlled the spice trade, mapped every corner of the Indian Ocean, and set up outposts all over the place. Australia was just a short trip from their bases in Indonesia. Some theories say Portuguese sailors saw Australia first, and there are strange old maps showing a big southern land labeled Java La Grande or Terra Australis. But these maps are vague, like someone drew them after a dream. There are no solid details, just odd names and foggy guesses. Why did the Portuguese not settle in Australia? The answer is as practical as it gets. From their point of view, there was nothing here to justify the risk. No spices, no gold, no slaves, no easy riches. Just tough land, tough people, and a lot of stinging, biting, or poisonous things. There are stories of the first landings. The first man is stung by a jellyfish, the second by a snake, the third steps on a rock and finds a spider, and the fourth is hit by a stone from an angry local. That was enough. The coast was marked as unfriendly, and the ships sailed on. The Dutch came next, and were the first to officially put Australia on the map. In the 17th century, Abel Tasman and his crew mapped the coastline and handed out new names like New Holland and Van Diemen's Land. They even named New Zealand after a region back home. Still, the Dutch had no plans to stay. The descriptions they left behind were not flattering. Too dry, too thorny, too hostile. Locals would not even share a drink of water. Some Dutch logs basically say, "Not recommended for a return visit." It is almost as if Australia gave off a signal, telling people to stay away. Every ship that stopped by turned right around. The land seemed to say, "You aren't ready for this. Please go away." And everyone listened. For explorers, there was no reward here, no easy riches, no friendly trading partners. The land was hot, dry, and full of surprises, most of them unpleasant. Why risk your ship, your crew, and your supplies for nothing but rocks and odd animals? The maps drawn by early explorers often seemed to exist just to remind people not to come back. Australia was like the anti-colony, a place that gently but firmly told the rest of the world, "Do not touch." And the world politely agreed, leaving the continent to its own quiet rhythm for almost all of human history. Chapter 6. The Dutch came, but it was like they never did. While the rest of the world was busy sailing to India, trading spices and grabbing coastlines, the Dutch decided to try something different. They were not just traders. They were also daring map makers who loved naming things and sketching out new lands. So, when they stumbled upon the mysterious southern continent, they did exactly what Dutch explorers do best. They named it New Holland. Because, of course, if you are Dutch, everything could be a New Holland, or at least a newer version of something back home. Abel Tasman, the famous Dutch explorer, became a key name in the 1640s. He discovered the island we now call Tasmania, and he charted parts of the northern coast of the continent. But make no mistake, he did not come because he just wanted to live there. He was simply looking for a practical trade route, and Australia just happened to get in the way. When they landed, they took a quick look around, saw people on the shore waving sticks and boomerangs, and almost immediately decided they would rather be back on the ship. Their time in Australia played out like a classic colonial disaster story. One sailor died within 3 minutes from a jellyfish sting. Another found a spider hiding in his boot, and that was the end of him as well. Someone else was bitten by a snake that was just passing through. The locals hurled rocks without any introductions or invitations. Even the tea situation was hopeless. There was none. All the Dutch got was a bush full of surprises and a lot of pain. The Dutch, though, were a nation that turned every failure into a new map. Even if they did not settle, they made sure to name everything they saw. The continent itself became New Holland. The island south of it was named Van Diemen's Land, which is now Tasmania. The large island to the southeast was named New Zealand, after a region in the Netherlands. This did not mean they settled or claimed the place in any lasting way. Their attitude was simple. We were here. Nobody liked it. But just in case, we gave it names. Later, the British would rename everything anyway, swapping out Dutch for English and replacing herring with tea and milk. As for contact with the locals, it was about as awkward as a blind date where one person is a European officer in boots and the other is a skilled hunter with a stick, silently wondering why you are there. The Dutch wanted to explore, map, and understand. The Aboriginal Australians wanted the newcomers to leave. There was no attempt at trade or ceremony. Locals stood on the beach, unfriendly as a gloomy swamp, and threw stones. Sometimes they played the didgeridoo. Sometimes they just watched silently. Either way, the message was clear. No casual conversation today. So there was no real contact, no exchange of gifts, not even a single word understood by both sides. In the end, the Dutch could only turn around and leave, with a mild sense of shame and the feeling that they had definitely not been invited. The first Dutch maps of Australia were about as vague and foreboding as possible. They showed a huge continent south of Indonesia, but no details about the interior, just the outline of the coast. The notes were full of warnings, dangerous shores, snakes, unfriendly natives, and unpredictable tides. There was always a line at the bottom, basically saying, "Not recommended for return, unless you have a really good reason." On Dutch maps, Australia was there, but nobody gave the impression that it was valuable or inviting. It was like the old attic in a family house. Sure, it exists, but you do not really want to go up there. Why did the Dutch not stay? Because they were practical. Why try to settle a continent where wheat will not grow? There is barely any water. The climate is wild, and the animals look like mistakes from a mad designer. The locals did not want to talk, and even the jellyfish were aggressive, almost like angry football fans. The Dutch could have put up a flag or started a tiny outpost. But then what? Feed the settlers rocks and bushes. It was far easier and much more profitable to stick with Indonesia, where the spices were abundant, the climate was comfortable, and trade actually made sense. Why swap profits for hard survival? In the end, here is the summary. The Dutch were the first Europeans to officially put Australia on the map. They gave it a name, drew its outline, wrote down that it was unpleasant, and then left. They never came back, except when passing by to check their course. So Australia remained marked, but not claimed. Nobody wanted to argue about it or fight for it. It just sat there, untouched and unconquered, watching as the next set of masts appeared on the horizon. The British were about to arrive, and with them, everything was about to change. Chapter 7. The Adventures of Cook and Britain's Secret Plan. Now it is time for one of the most important characters in the story of Australia, Captain James Cook. He is remembered as the man who officially opened Australia for the British Crown. But Cook was not just an explorer and a sailor. In many ways, he was also a secret agent for the British Empire. His journey is often described as a scientific mission. But if you look closer, it is clear there was a lot more going on behind the scenes. In 1768, Cook set out on his famous voyage aboard the Endeavour. The official reason? He was supposed to observe the planet Venus as it crossed in front of the Sun, a rare event that would help scientists calculate the distance between Earth and the Sun. It all sounded very noble and scientific. But as soon as Cook finished watching Venus from Tahiti, he received a sealed envelope with secret instructions, just like something out of a spy movie. Inside, the orders were simple. Head south, find the mysterious Terra Australis, map it, claim it for Britain, and if it was already claimed, sort things out. If it was not, take it for the crown. Britain had a very practical reason for this secret mission. They were about to lose their American colonies to revolution. Suddenly, they needed new lands to call their own, and preferably places where nobody else had moved in yet. Australia was enormous, untamed, and, as far as they knew, completely ignored by everyone else. It was like finding a hidden gem at a garage sale, just waiting for someone to pick it up. When Cook and his crew finally reached the east coast of Australia, history changed. They landed in a place Cook would call Botany Bay, because the botanists on board were thrilled by all the new plants. The scientists wanted to take everything home, amazed by the strange and wonderful flora. The local Aboriginal people, however, were not impressed. To them, a strange wooden house was drifting into the bay, full of pale men with metal gadgets and unclear intentions. Their response was simple: stand up, frown, and start throwing things. It was their usual welcome for unexpected guests. Despite this chilly reception, Cook carefully mapped the coast, noted that the Dutch had been to the west, but claimed the east as unoccupied. He wrote in his journal that the Dutch had rights to the western part, then crossed out that line and never mentioned it again. It was as if he realized there was no reason to give away anything to the Dutch, who had not shown much interest anyway. With a simple change in his diary, the east coast of Australia became British territory. No wars, no complicated diplomacy, just a quiet claim on paper. The place where Cook landed would later become the site of the first British colony, Sydney. The city is named after Lord Sydney, a British politician who signed the papers but never saw Australia. From that moment on, the continent that everyone else ignored became the new hope for the British Empire, at least on paper. For a while, nobody actually moved there. Why did Britain make the claim? All the other powers were busy somewhere else. The Dutch were focused on Indonesia. The French were dreaming of other places. The Portuguese were lost in their many colonies, and the Spanish never really figured out what Australia was. The British arrived at the right moment, just after losing America, and needed to rebuild their empire with new ideas. They wanted tighter control, better management, and to avoid the mistakes of the past. Australia became the first experiment for this new approach. The plan was clear. It would not be a land for free settlers at first. It would be a place to send people who did not want to go anywhere, or people the government wanted to send far away. The next chapter of Australia's story would be about convicts, forced labor, and building a society from the hardest beginnings. But at this point, it was all very clean and official. Cook had made his maps. He declared the land was empty and claimed it for Britain. The papers were sent to London, and the entire east coast of Australia became part of the empire. Without a single shot fired, without a fight, and without anyone else even showing up to argue. Sometimes history changes simply because everyone else is busy somewhere else. Chapter 8: Prison for Export. The real story of Australia as a British colony starts with a kick, not to the Australians, but to the British convicts. At the end of the 18th century, after Britain lost its American colonies, the empire faced a very practical problem: what to do with all their thieves, pickpockets, troublemakers, and Irish rebels. The issue was not philosophical, it was physical. Prisons were overflowing. Some people were kept on old ships rotting in London's docks. And now that America had declared independence, the British lost their convenient dumping ground. For years, unwanted people had been shipped across the ocean, one-way ticket, chains, and a life far away in Virginia. Suddenly, this option was closed. The result? Crowds of prisoners in Britain, all costing the government a lot of money. Imagine being jailed for stealing a chicken, and then the state is stuck feeding, housing, and treating you for years. So what now? Enter Australia. British officials looked at their maps and thought, here's a huge continent, empty as far as we're concerned, and nobody seems to want it. Why not use it for all these convicts? This is how the First Fleet comes into the story. The name sounds grand, like a bold voyage to a new world. But in reality, it was a convoy of 11 ships carrying 750 convicts, 250 soldiers, a handful of officials, seeds, barrels of water, and a few nearly dead goats. The journey took 8 months. It was less of a cruise, more of a desperate relocation. Out of the 750 convicts, about 550 were men, and the rest women. The women were not carefully chosen, just whoever was available. This created a very odd mix of people to build a new society. Not exactly the founding fathers and mothers you see in history books. In 1788, the First Fleet arrived in Botany Bay, the same spot Cook had praised, but quickly realized the place was terrible for anchoring ships, so they moved north, found a better bay, and called it Port Jackson. There, they built the first settlement, which they named Sydney, after Lord Sydney, a British minister who had never seen Australia and probably never wanted to. This was the beginning of the colony called New South Wales, the first official British outpost on this harsh, thorny, hot, and deeply uncomfortable continent. The plan was simple. Convicts would work, the land would be farmed, crops would grow, and Britain would get the benefits. Reality, of course, was very different. The land was not fertile. Crops did not grow. The convicts got sick, stole from each other, and rebelled. People died, many of them. The first attempt at farming ended in disaster. Wheat, barley, potatoes, nothing would grow. The soil was dry, rocky, and covered with a thin layer of dust. Local plants were nothing like home. Most were sharp, poisonous, or just looked wrong. Food supplies ran out fast. Starvation set in. The First Fleet came close to complete collapse. They only survived by making emergency runs to South Africa and nearby islands for supplies. It turned out the Aboriginal Australians had been right all along. Almost nothing would grow here unless you worked twice as hard as anywhere else. The British came with shovels and hope, but hope was not enough. What was life like for a convict? If you think the Australian penal system was just a few hours of work and then freedom, think again. It was brutal. People were chained together in groups of 5, forced to labor under the burning sun, with no familiar food, terrible hygiene, and clothing that should have been burned after the first day. All this was under the eye of officers with nearly absolute power. The colony's military governor had more authority than the king back in England. He could pardon, execute, distribute land, or make any decision he wanted. The main rule was to keep everyone under strict control. No freedom like in America, only discipline and suffering. Even water was a problem. Australia is the driest inhabited continent on Earth. There are few rivers, hidden water sources, and rain is rare. Open water was almost non-existent. People died of thirst, especially during droughts. It would not be until the 19th century that they found underground water. Until then, they carried water any way they could, or they died. Australia was more than just a prison. It was basically a social experiment. It was a mix of criminals, guards, bureaucrats, botanists, engineers, and random women, all thrown together at the end of the world. There was no outside help, no steady supplies, and no clear plan. Just a single order: figure it out. And surprisingly, something started to take shape. Gradually, they built warehouses, barracks, and roads. They learned to grow what actually would survive. They brought in livestock. Some convicts served their sentences and stayed because they had nowhere else to go. Others gained freedom and disappeared into the bush. Some became bushrangers, bandits hiding in the wilderness, robbing farms and travelers. This was the beginning of Australia. Not a toast on a ship, not a flag raising, not a national anthem. Just hunger, fear, disease, and backbreaking work. It was not a paradise, but a giant British prison camp on the edge of the known world. But this was the start, and soon new waves would arrive. More convicts, and eventually free settlers. The infrastructure would grow, sheep would be imported, and the economy would slowly change. At that point, Australia's story would shift from being only a prison to becoming a real land of opportunity. Chapter 9. Wheat would not grow, but sheep could. Nothing humbles a British officer quite like a cabbage that refuses to grow. Imagine sitting at the edge of the known world, in uncomfortable boots, watching your carrots wither and your potatoes rot in the ground. Even a strong cup of tea cannot make up for the disappointment. Australia was clear. If you want to build an agricultural empire here, you're in for a surprise. The British learned quickly that farming would not work, not right away, and certainly not with the crops they were used to. Wheat failed. Oats and barley died off. The soil was poor, water was scarce, and the sun was harsh. Everything the settlers tried to plant ended up as dust and disappointment. But then someone had a new idea. Sheep. One of the newly arrived, better-educated farmers took a look around and said, "Why not raise sheep? The pastures here are endless." This was a turning point. Australia, it turned out, could not feed people very well, but it could feed sheep, lots and lots of sheep. The animals munched dry grass, did not complain about the conditions, and in return provided wool, meat, manure, and, in their own way, some hope by the struggling colony. From this moment, the colony's future changed. When you cannot grow wheat, you grow wool. Sheep became the center of the Australian economy. You were no longer just a farmer, you were a sheep owner. The number of sheep you had decided your status, your future, and your place in society. The British quickly discovered that wool was gold on legs, especially the fine merino wool that was in high demand back in Britain, where the textile industry was booming. Wool became the raw material of the empire, and Australia's fate was tied to its sheep. That is why people began to say, "Australia rides on the sheep's back." It was not a joke. For much of the 19th and even 20th century, wool was the colony's main export and economic driver. Bringing in sheep was not just a business decision. It transformed the landscape. With hundreds of thousands of animals, the land itself changed. The sheep ate the bushes and grasses, pushing out native animals and plants. Where there was once wild bush, there were now vast pastures and huge sheep stations, farms so large that, as travel guides of the 19th century warned, if you walk from the eastern fence to the western one, bring food, water, and a compass. These stations could be the size of entire countries in Europe. Australia was no longer just a convict outpost. It was becoming a sheep empire. Hard labor was still everywhere, as most of the work was done by former convicts released on condition. The British upper class managed some stations, but more often it was young adventurers, people who came to Australia dreaming of land, fortune, and wool. They took up land, expanded their holdings, hired laborers, and created their own little kingdoms. This was the beginning of a new Australian class, not lords or traditional nobility, but wool barons. Many started with just a few sheep, and 20 years later owned lands big enough to fit an entire European city. And what about the Aboriginal Australians? They were pushed aside. The land used for new farms had always belonged to someone. Aboriginal people did not have paperwork, but they had myth, story, memory, and sacred paths. The British had official documents and muskets. Aboriginal Australians were often driven out, killed, or forced into labor. Sometimes they got food or clothing, often nothing. In some places, the violence was so extreme, it would be called genocide today. But back then, it was just labeled as frontier incidents. For the first peoples, this was the end of their world. Their land became grazing fields, their roots became roads, their myths dismissed as stories. Yet with sheep came infrastructure. Moving wool required roads, storage, banks, and ports. A new economy meant people settled down, built houses, and started families. People began to plan for the future and create a society, not just survive another day. Australia now became a project. Britain was no longer just getting rid of people. It was building a country. It was still rough, harsh, and wild, but you could already see the skeleton of a new nation. And through it all, the sheep simply ate, slept, and grew. Quietly, they became the animals that saved the continent and reshaped it forever. Chapter 10. Bushrangers, Lawlessness, and the Land of Bandits. Picture the Australian landscape in the 19th century. There is a dusty road, dry trees, and the sun is blazing like an oven with no temperature control. On the horizon, you might see a rider in a wide-brimmed hat, a rifle tucked under his coat. This is not a scene from an old western, but from the real Australia of the frontier. That rider could be a bushranger, one of many outlaws, runaways, and wandering criminals whose stories still fill Australian legends. In the 19th century, Australia was no longer just a prison camp, but it was not a fully formed nation either. It was a place where the law had just begun to reach, but the wilderness was still calling to anyone bold enough to disappear into it. For people who ended up on the continent against their will, or who wanted to start over, this was a land of second chances and constant risk. So, who were the bushrangers? Originally, the word bushranger simply meant someone hiding in the wild, usually an escaped convict who ran from a farm, a mine, or a work gang. They survived in the bush, alone or in groups, sometimes living by theft, sometimes helping others. Over time, bushranger became the word for anyone outside the law, someone who robbed, fought, and lived by their own rules. For the authorities, bushrangers were a threat to order. For many poor settlers, they became something like folk heroes, even an Australian version of Robin Hood. Why were bushrangers so common? There are a few big reasons. First, Australia is enormous. If someone wanted to vanish, the bush gave them thousands of places to hide. It was not like London, where you could block off a few streets and catch a criminal. Second, the colonial government was weak in the early days. There were just a few officers, some soldiers, and a lot of improvising. Third, many of the first settlers were convicts. A lot of them were punished for petty crimes, like stealing bread. For many, breaking away from the system was a natural next step. Finally, in a society where your past as a convict followed you everywhere, some people saw rebellion or adventure as their only path to a new life. Bushrangers first appeared in big numbers early in the 19th century, but the real explosion came during the gold rush years. People were moving all over the country, carrying gold, money, and supplies. All this movement made for tempting targets. A few bushrangers became legends. Ben Hall robbed banks, wagons, and even police, but he was known for leaving women and the poor alone. He became almost a hero to many. Frank Gardner was famous for his escapes and daring raids. People compared him to Napoleon, if Napoleon had spent his time in the Australian dust. The most famous bushranger of all was Ned Kelly. He grew up poor, in a world that treated Irish families as outsiders. He was chased by the police for small crimes. His family suffered, and eventually Ned chose to fight back. He built a gang, planned robberies, and spoke out against what he saw as injustice. Ned even wrote a long letter to explain his actions and ask for fairness. Ned Kelly's story ended in a siege at Glenrowan. He and his gang fought the police while wearing iron armor they had built themselves. In the end, Ned was wounded and captured. He was tried, sentenced to death, and hanged. His last words were simple: "Such is life." That phrase has become part of the Australian spirit. Many ordinary settlers actually felt sympathy for the bushrangers. They knew the system was unfair. The land belonged to the rich. Judges came from the upper class, and most people had very few chances. For many, a bushranger was not just a villain, but someone who dared to cross a line and challenge a system that seemed rigged against them. The government fought back hard. They formed special police squads, gave rewards for capturing bushrangers, and sometimes even arrested their families to force them out of hiding. The fights were nothing like movies. They took place far from towns, in muddy fields, pouring rain, and rocky hills. They often ended with betrayal or tragedy. No matter what the authorities did, bushrangers became a part of Australian culture. They were not just criminals, but symbols of a wild and untamed country. Their stories became books, songs, movies, and even art. Ned Kelly's helmet is now a national icon, seen in museums and even on graffiti walls in Melbourne. At this stage, Australia was still a land where order had not yet arrived, and rebellion was often celebrated. It was out of this chaos that a unique society began to emerge, with its own heroes, rebels, and stories about what is right and what is wrong. Chapter 11. The Gold Rush. By the middle of the 19th century, Australia was no longer just a convict colony. It was a land of pastures, with millions of sheep grazing across open fields. Soft wool was the main export. Sheep farmers and station owners were the new elites, and rural life was the foundation of everything. It seemed like Australia had found its calling and would remain a wool nation for a long time. Then one day, everything changed when gold fever hit the continent and turned life upside down. While sheep grazed quietly, hidden under the earth was another treasure, gold. The first significant discoveries came in 1851 in New South Wales, in a region that had been full of sheep just a few years before. At first, British officials tried to keep the gold a secret. They worried workers would abandon their farms and herds for a shot at sudden wealth. But news travels fast, and soon the gold rush had begun. Suddenly, the country was full of noise, excitement, and new faces. Adventurers, prospectors, and immigrants from all over the world poured into the valleys and plains. Yesterday's sheep farmers were now digging for gold, or else they were desperately trying to keep their old way of life going. Tent cities sprang up, where flocks once grazed, and gold fields appeared on what used to be peaceful farmland. For a while, wool and gold competed for the top spot. Some people dreamed of fast riches, others wanted to keep their stable, predictable lives. Gold changed everything. The economy shifted almost overnight. For a few years, sheep farming took a back seat, as gold became the main source of income and export. Banks opened everywhere. New buildings went up in Melbourne and Sydney, and railways started to connect ports with the new gold fields. Money was flowing, and the whole country felt it. Society changed too. Prospectors were often bold, independent, and noisy. They brought a new spirit of adventure and risk-taking. But the gold rush also brought trouble. The government introduced license fees for digging, which led to protests and conflict with police. There were also clashes between different groups, especially with Chinese immigrants who had come to try their luck. Tensions ran high as thousands of people chased the same dream in a crowded, chaotic environment. The towns themselves changed almost overnight. Small farming settlements turned into bustling cities. Many of today's biggest Australian cities owe their rapid growth to the gold rush. The population exploded, and new businesses sprang up to serve the booming demand. Gold also broke down the old class barriers. Suddenly, anyone could strike it rich. Success might come to a former convict, a poor shepherd, or a new arrival from overseas. The traditional ladder of landowners and station managers was shaken by the possibilities of gold. The dream that anyone could change their fortune became part of the national identity. Still, all this change brought conflict. The old Australia of sheep and steady routines clashed with the new Australia of prospectors and quick fortunes. Sheep owners worried about losing their land and workers. Prospectors complained about powerful landowners and wanted more rights to dig. In some places, these struggles grew heated and violent. Some people wanted to keep herding sheep. Others wanted to dig for gold. As time passed, the gold began to run out. By the end of the 19th century, the fever had faded and sheep returned to center stage. Australia became again a land of pastures and massive sheep stations. But the country had changed forever. There were new roads, banks, and thriving cities. There was a new spirit of independence and possibility. The gold rush did not destroy the old sheep farming Australia. Instead, the two traditions became part of the same culture. Australians still love telling stories of fortune seekers at the riverbanks, while also being proud of their wide open pastures and hard-working farmers. Out of this mixture came a national character, part dreamer, part realist, and always ready to believe that anything is possible, even if you were herding sheep yesterday and are panning for gold today. Chapter 12. Aboriginal Australians and the British, a clash of worldviews. When the British arrived in Australia, they encountered local peoples who lived as nomads or semi-nomads. Most Aboriginal Australians did not build permanent settlements, did not farm the land in a European sense, did not organize formal trade, and did not unite under centralized authority. To the British, raised on the Protestant ethic, where hard work and farming were seen almost as sacred duties, this way of life was puzzling, even suspicious. In the British and broader Protestant worldview, land only had real value if it was improved. You built houses, planted crops, tamed nature, and made every patch of ground productive. Many English books and speeches from that era repeated the idea that a real nation was one that built, created, and worked for the future. The farmer or city builder was considered a person of God, someone who shaped the world through labor and discipline. Against this background, Aboriginal Australians seemed completely different. They lived in small groups, moving with the seasons to find resources. They did not farm or build cities. They didn't focus on collecting wealth or producing more than they needed. For many British officials and settlers, this looked like a lack of civilization, a sign of backwardness, or even an absence of real culture. The idea that Aboriginal people owned or cared for the land simply did not register. In the British legal and mental framework, land that wasn't being farmed or built on was terra nullius, nobody's land. If nobody improved it, then it was available for the taking. This was not necessarily a calculated act of cruelty. It was just the familiar way of thinking, one that made it easier to ignore difficult moral questions. In reality, Aboriginal Australians had their own complex social and territorial systems. Each clan had traditional land, ceremonies, taboos, and inherited routes that defined how they lived. These were not states with kings or parliaments, but webs of relationships between people, nature, and myth. The connection was not shown through building cities, but through keeping balance and tradition alive. But for the colonists, this looked vague and impractical. There were no written titles, no marked borders, nothing resembling British concepts of ownership. As a result, the land was declared empty, and Aboriginal people were seen almost as part of the landscape instead of fellow citizens. Attempts at dialogue were rare. The British did not see potential partners for treaties. They saw an obstacle to colonization. The approach was simple. If the land was needed, the people on it were moved. Many Aboriginal Australians died from diseases brought by Europeans. Others were killed or pushed away through violence, while some were forced to adapt or become dependent on colonial authorities. Aboriginal culture could not be quickly integrated. There were no kings, no parliament, and no army to conquer. There was no tradition of collecting property or building strict hierarchies. The land itself was not a commodity, but a part of cultural and spiritual life. For the colonizers, this way of life seemed formless, something that could be ignored, or swept aside more easily than understood. The process was not a single event. It was a long, slow erasure, a fading into the background. Only in the 20th century did serious attempts to recognize Aboriginal rights begin. Activists pushed for citizenship, land rights, and cultural renewal. But by then, much had been lost. Languages, traditions, and ancient paths had disappeared. Australia became a country where two different ways of living met, but rarely connected. One world was about work, ownership, and transforming the environment. The other was about tradition, observation, and living gently on the land. For a long time, one side did not see or recognize the other. Only recently have there been efforts to understand what was lost and to rebuild some of what can be restored. Chapter 13. Gaining Independence. By the end of the 19th century, Australia was no longer just a distant penal colony ruled from London. It had become a vast continent, full of growing cities, a strong economy, and new generations of people who saw themselves as Australians first. Still, on paper, Australia was simply a group of British colonies. Each region was led by a governor sent from London, and the laws were created with British interests in mind. At this point, Australia was made up of 6 separate colonies: New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania. Each one had its own laws and its own money. Even the railway tracks were different widths, making travel and trade between colonies a real challenge. Disagreements and trade barriers popped up, just like you would see between completely different countries. People started to realize that if Australia wanted to truly grow and succeed, it needed a single system. It needed a shared market, unified laws, and a sense of being one nation. The days of being just a scattered outpost of the British Empire were coming to an end. Toward the end of the 19th century, serious talks began about uniting the colonies. Politicians, business leaders, thinkers, and everyday people joined in debates and conventions about the future. They asked big questions. How should power be shared between local governments and a new national government? Where should the new capital be? How could the rights of the smaller states be protected? These discussions went on for years. People argued over trade taxes, women's rights, and what place Aboriginal Australians should have in the new country. Eventually, a broad agreement emerged. Australia should become a single federation, but stay part of the British Empire as a self-governing dominion. Australia's official birthday is January 1st, 1901. On that day, a law passed by the British Parliament took effect, and the 6 colonies became the 6 states of the new Commonwealth of Australia. Australia now had its own parliament, a prime minister, its own laws, its own national flag, and a high court to settle legal disputes. To solve the argument over where to put the capital, Australia built a brand new city, Canberra. This way, neither Sydney nor Melbourne would win the prize. The British monarch stayed on as head of state, but real decisions were now made in Australia. Federation did not bring instant independence. For many years, Australia still had legal and political ties to London. Until the middle of the 20th century, British courts could overturn decisions made in Australia, and new laws still needed the monarch's formal approval. It was only in 1942, during World War II that Australia passed laws making its independence from Britain official. The final legal ties with London were not cut until 1986, with the passing of the Australia Act. From then on, all decisions about government and law were made in Australia itself. Unlike countries such as the United States or India, Australia gained independence gradually through negotiation and debate instead of war or revolution. Even today, Australia keeps a respectful relationship with the British Crown. The monarch is still technically the head of state, but this is now a symbolic role with no real power. So what changed when Australia became independent? The country gained not just new rights, but new responsibilities. Australia became an active member of the world community, joining organizations like the League of Nations and the United Nations. New roads and cities were built, universities opened, and Australian culture started to grow on its own. Perhaps the most important change was a new sense of identity. Australians began to see themselves as more than just Britain on the edge of the world. They saw themselves as citizens of a large, independent country with the freedom to shape its own future and its own story. Chapter 14. Platypuses, Echidnas, Kangaroos, the Emu War, Dingoes, and the invasion of the rabbits. If nature had a creative department, Australia would be its wildest laboratory. Everything here looks like an evolutionary experiment. The animals are like nowhere else. Their behaviors often make no sense, and even professional biologists sometimes have to pause and ask if what they are seeing is real. When the first British naturalists encountered Australia in the 19th century, they were stunned. The animals seemed like a mix-and-match game gone wrong. It was as if someone set the mammal template, but checked every box for experimental features. Let's start with the famous platypus. When the first preserved specimens and drawings arrived in London, the reaction was confusion and disbelief. What is this? It's a platypus. No, seriously. Did you sew a duck's bill onto a beaver? No, it's real. So it has a bill like a duck. Yes. And it lays eggs. Yes. But it also feeds its young with milk. The milk does not come from nipples. It just seeps through the skin. And it has venom? Yes, the males have venomous spurs on their hind legs. Are you making fun of us? No, though, it was not a joke. The platypus is a mammal that lays eggs, has no nipples, delivers milk through its fur, swims with its eyes closed using electrolocation, and has a bill that is part radar and part shovel. It lives in a burrow, is nocturnal, makes almost no noise, and for years the British Museum was convinced it was a fake. Only after years of study did scientists finally accept that it was a real living animal. Then there is the echidna, another egg-laying mammal. It is not related to the hedgehog. The echidna is a distant cousin of the platypus, but it digs instead of swims. Its nose is long and sticky. It eats ants, digs burrows, and has almost no teeth. And yes, it lays eggs too. The male echidna even has a four-headed reproductive organ. But that is a story for another time. Trying to find logic here is a waste of the effort. Australian wildlife is not about logic. It is about isolation. For millions of years, Australia was cut off from the rest of the world. There were no big predators, no outside competition, and no mass migrations. Nature just did its own thing. The kangaroo is probably Australia's most famous animal. You will find it anywhere else. It is a large marsupial that perfectly fits the strange spirit of the continent. Kangaroos cannot move backward. They always hop forward on powerful back legs, using their long tails for balance. Families of kangaroos graze together in the bush, coming out at dawn and dusk, often freezing in place to listen to every sound. In that quiet stillness and in their effortless movement across the plains and forests, there is something truly Australian. Today, the kangaroo is not only the country's symbol, but also a part of everyday life. There are about 40 to 50 million kangaroos in Australia, which is double the number of people. For some, they are an object of fascination and tourist photos. For others, they are a daily reality and sometimes a problem. In many places, kangaroos wander onto farms and roads, eat crops, and even cause traffic accidents. You see them on the national coat of arms, on coins and in souvenirs, but you also hear about efforts to control their numbers, to keep nature and agriculture in balance. This strange relationship combines awe and annoyance. The kangaroo is always present, more than just wildlife. It is a neighbor. Sometimes living side by side is not peaceful. Kangaroos usually avoid people, but stories of boxing kangaroos have become part of local folklore. Big males, especially during mating season or while defending their territory, can be aggressive. There have been reports of kangaroos attacking dogs or even people if they feel threatened. While most encounters end without injury, these episodes are often told with a sense of humor around the campfire. After all, a kangaroo fight is just part of Australian life. If the kangaroo is the official symbol, then the emu is its unofficial rival. The emu is a huge flightless bird, second only to the ostrich in size, and even more stubborn. Emus do not care about fences, road signs, or anyone's plans. Flocks of them march through fields, ignoring every obstacle, like their own army on the move. In the 1930s, the emus even won the famous Emu War, where Australian farmers and the army tried to stop them with machine guns, but the birds simply outran the bullets and returned later as if nothing had happened. The emu remains a living reminder that no matter how many cities humans build, there are still creatures in the bush who follow their own rules. Dingoes, the wild dogs of Australia, are some of the continent's most mysterious and controversial residents. Aboriginal Australians valued them as hunting partners, but for European farmers, dingoes became a nightmare, preying on sheep and livestock. In response, Australians built one of the longest fences in the world, the dingo fence, which stretches over 5,000 kilometers from southern Queensland into South Australia. This fence was meant to protect flocks from dingo attacks, but it stands as a monument to human stubbornness and the unpredictable nature of the land. Even today, the fence is regularly maintained, a constant reminder that Australian nature can only ever be controlled temporarily. Then there is the story of rabbits, maybe the best example of a small idea gone disastrously wrong. In the mid-19th century, European settlers brought a few pairs of wild rabbits for hunting and comfort. The climate was so perfect that within a few decades, the country was overrun by a wave of furry invaders. Rabbits ate everything: grass, bushes, roots. Land was stripped bare, erosion followed, pastures collapsed, and desperate farmers built fences, set traps, and even used viruses to fight the invasion. The rabbits survived it all, outsmarting every trick. Even today, Australia battles this unstoppable population, which has become one of the most important lessons about the dangers of upsetting nature's balance. And finally, there are the giant flying foxes. Some Australian cities, especially in the north, are home to vast colonies of these fruit bats, with wingspans of up to 1.5 meters. At sunset, hundreds of them rise from the trees, filling the sky and giving the city a surreal, almost dreamlike atmosphere. Australia's wildlife is full of surprises, and every animal here has a story. Some are inspiring, some are cautionary, but all of them remind you that this continent is a world apart, strange, unpredictable, and unforgettable. Chapter 15. On welfare, but content. It has been more than 2 centuries since the first British ships sailed into Port Jackson. The colony has grown, sheep have multiplied, gold has come and gone. Bushrangers have become legends, and the Australian bush has turned into a setting for tourists' photographs. Yet, in one part of this history, time seems to have slowed down. Where the descendants of Australia's first people remain, civilization often passed them by, or perhaps passed close, but not through. Today, Australia is a technologically advanced and wealthy country, but it still has an invisible layer, a world of people who never truly became part of the mainstream story. So what happened to the descendants of Aboriginal Australians? In short, they were not destroyed physically, but they were excluded by the system. They became part of the country, but not part of the national project. They were not enslaved as in Latin America, and they were not entirely removed as in the United States, but they did not become an active part of the country's main structure. They were not given the tools to fit into the new economy. Access to education was limited. No one taught them the survival skills needed in a capitalist society. Many Aboriginal Australians found themselves as strangers in their own homeland, living on the margins of a nation that had changed around them. Starting in the late 19th century, various care programs were launched, but these were often a form of isolation. Settlements were created, land was set aside, and people were relocated, trained, or adapted. Many times, this was done against their will. In the 20th century, this approach turned into welfare policies. The government offered financial support and told people to live quietly and not lose hope. On paper, this was social protection. In practice, it often meant pushing people even further into invisibility. Living on welfare often means being left out of the movement and growth of the wider society. Many Aboriginal Australians ended up living in small settlements, far from the cities, in government-built houses, with little work and few opportunities. Unemployment, alcoholism, and domestic violence rates are high. Trust in the government is low. Many people struggle with a sense of broken identity. Who is responsible for this? It is not simply a matter of historical blame. The problem is rooted in a system that was created without their participation. When a country is built, without considering its original cultures, it ends up with 2 countries inside one. Afterward, the government tries to catch up by offering compensation, returning land, or attempting to explain the past. Culture, though, is stubborn. If your ancestors taught you for generations to live slowly, not to hoard, not to build up savings, but to exist in the present moment, then joining a society that values rushing, saving, and constant planning can feel almost unbearable. This is the main paradox. Many modern Aboriginal Australians do not want to become like everyone else. They want to preserve their traditions, remember their ancient paths, sing their songs, and stay connected to the rhythms of the land. They do not care about skyscrapers. What really matters is that the river still flows, as it always did, and that no one stops them from sharing stories around the fire. The reality, though, is that modern infrastructure stands in the way. Roads, fences, farms, and mines. The lands that once held their ancestral roots are now private property or mining sites. Sacred places have become zones of extraction and industry. To be Aboriginal in the 21st century often means living with compromise, and sometimes that compromise is painful. And still, they endure. Despite the losses and the broken connections, Aboriginal culture is alive. People continue to sing songs, restore languages, perform rituals, and reclaim land through the courts. Heritage centers are being built. Children are learning the old myths and roots. Some Aboriginal Australians become lawyers to defend their community's rights. Some become scientists, linguists, or anthropologists. Others remain in the outback, far from the internet, with a drum and a story. All of this is part of Australia, not just in the textbooks, but in real life. There is an irony here. Those who were once labeled as backward are now seen as the keepers of a resilient worldview. In a world that talks about climate crisis, loss of connection with nature, and spiritual emptiness, Aboriginal Australians have already lived through all of it. They know how to live without excess, how to listen to the land without destroying it, and how to value stillness more than speed. In the end, their quiet resilience may be the most valuable lesson Australia can offer. Chapter 16. Modern Australia, Cities, Laws, and Everyday Life. Australia today is a far cry from the old days of bush, convicts, and boomerangs. It is now a modern democratic country and a member of the G20, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and many other international groups. The nation is known for its high incomes, excellent quality of life, and a climate that can switch from beach weather to wildfires and from deserts to tropical forests. So what is life really like inside the country? Where do people live? What do they do? And can you move there? Where people live. Australia is the sixth largest country on Earth, but it is almost empty in the middle. Most people live along the eastern and southeastern coasts. The center is a vast red desert, where only the most solitary types, or those working at remote mines, tend to stay. In fact, 95% of the population lives in cities. The major cities are Sydney, the largest city, located on the east coast. It is the country's financial, media, and tourism center. Melbourne, known as the cultural capital, full of art, theaters, bookstores, and, of course, coffee shops. Brisbane, a warm, sunny city in Queensland, popular with new immigrants. Perth, an isolated but thriving city in the west, actually closer to Jakarta than to Sydney. Adelaide, calm, family-oriented, surrounded by wine country. Canberra, the purpose-built capital, placed between Sydney and Melbourne to keep both cities happy. How politics work. Australia is a constitutional monarchy. Technically, the King of the United Kingdom is still the head of state, represented by the Governor-General. In reality, this is a symbolic role. The real power belongs to the Prime Minister and a two-house parliament. The political system is stable, democratic, and known for regular elections and strong checks and balances. There are two main political parties: the Liberal Party, which is center-right and favors business and lower taxes; the Labour Party, which is center-left and supports social programs and unions. Occasionally, the Greens or regional parties win seats, but the country generally avoids political extremes. The economy. Australia's economy is a mix of natural resources and services. Mining. The country is a top exporter of iron ore, coal, gold, gas, and lithium, especially to China. Agriculture. Wheat, beef, wool, and wine are major exports. Sheep farming is still worth billions. Tourism. The Great Barrier Reef, kangaroos, surfing, icebergs, and deserts are all sold as the real Australia. Education. Australian universities, especially in Melbourne and Sydney, attract international students and bring in billions. Financial services and tech. These sectors are growing fast, mostly in Melbourne and Sydney. Australians enjoy one of the world's highest standards of living. The GDP per person is among the top 10 globally, but prices are high, especially for housing in the big cities. Immigration. Australia is one of the world's most immigrant-friendly countries. Nearly 30% of the population was born overseas. The immigration system uses a points-based model, where your age, education, English skills, profession, and work experience all count. There are special visas for students, investors, refugees, skilled workers, and people who are willing to move to less populated regions. Everything is clear and structured, with checklists for each pathway. If you meet the requirements, your chances are good. However, the rules are strict. Australia does not allow people to immigrate just because. If you are an engineer, doctor, programmer, teacher, or chef with good English, you can get a visa, permanent residency, and citizenship after 4 years. Australia also has a tough border policy. Unauthorized arrivals are quickly sent back, and boats carrying migrants are turned around. Those who do get in are often sent to offshore processing centers. Society and everyday life. Australians are known for being pragmatic and having a sense of humor. They love nature, sports, barbecues, and the sea, and are generally not impressed by status or formalities. The society is mostly secular, tolerant, and stable. People appreciate informality, but they are not careless. The education system is strong. Health care is partly public, through Medicare, and partly private. Social support exists, but it is not excessive. Of course, there are problems. High housing costs, growing inequality, difficult relationships with the First Peoples, and environmental challenges like wildfires, droughts, and the threatened coral reefs. Despite these issues, trust in public institutions remains high, and most Australians believe their country is headed in the right direction. Australia's journey has taken it from a prison colony to a model progressive state. Its story is full of unusual choices, strange twists of fate, and a stubborn sense of optimism. Platypuses still live here. You can still run off into the bush if you want, but now you can do it with internet access, a bank card, and the right to vote. Conclusion. Our journey has come to an end. Together, we have explored one of the world's youngest, yet most remarkable countries. A land just over 2 centuries old, shaped by ancient peoples, walking dreamtime paths, by convicts staring out from dusty camps, and by bushrangers clad in makeshift armor. You have touched a continent that remained misunderstood and untamed for centuries, never quite fitting the world's expectations. Now, as you settle in for sleep, take a moment to reflect. What do you think of Australia and its unique history? Could you live as the Aboriginal Australians once did, unhurried, moving with the rhythm of the land, surrounded by its wild plants and animals? If you have thoughts to share, join the conversation. Sharing ideas is always valuable. Let all these images slowly fade into the gentle quiet of your sleep. Red sand, waves of wool, the unwavering stare of a platypus, an elder with a spear by the fire. They do not need analysis or conclusions. They can simply remain with you, like the faint track of an old path in your memory. Thank you for traveling this far. May this strange, warm, and contrasting land visit you tonight in your healing sleep. May your rest be peaceful and your morning clear. Until we meet again. Good night. And there you have it, little dreamer. Another tale, tucked in and told, like a blanket of stars across your mind. If you're still awake, well, bless your stamina. And if you somehow forgot to tap, like, or subscribe earlier, go ahead and do it now, before the dreams pull you under. I'll be right here, waiting in the next story. Until then, sleep well and sail gently.